In war, information is power, and in 1939, as Europe trembled under the shadow of the expanding Nazi domination, Germany possessed a weapon that did not explode, did not burn, did not leave craters in cities, yet it promised control over them all. It was small enough to sit on a desk, compact, mechanical, deceptively ordinary, the Enigma machine. To the German High Command, Enigma was not simply equipment, it was assurance. An invisible shield wrapped around every command, every maneuver, every whispered strategy of conquest. And if that shield ever cracked, the illusion of invincibility would collapse, but no one in Berlin believed such a crack was even possible. The Enigma machine worked through rotating electrical rotors, each keystroke scrambling letters through a labyrinth of wiring. Press a and a different letter illuminated. Press it again and the internal configuration had shifted, transforming the output. With 3 rotors alone, millions of combinations were possible. Add plugboard connections and daily key changes, and the permutations soared into astronomical figures. The Germans believed the mathematics itself stood guard. Orders to U-boats prowling the Atlantic, coordination of Luftwaffe air raids, logistical planning across occupied Europe, all of it flowed through Enigma's encrypted pulse. The Allies could intercept these transmissions. They had listening stations scattered across Britain and beyond, capturing the crackling Morse code signals sent across continents and seas. But interception without comprehension is silence disguised as sound. The messages piled up, indecipherable streams of letters that concealed life and death decisions. Somewhere within those coded lines were the coordinates of submarines stalking merchant ships. Somewhere inside those electrical whispers were the blueprints of destruction. Germany's confidence in Enigma hardened into certainty. Officers were trained to believe it was mathematically unbreakable. The machine's daily key settings ensured that even if yesterday's message were somehow solved, today's would remain secure. It was not arrogance alone. It was trust in engineering, trust in logic, trust in a system that seemed beyond human reach. And that confidence emboldened strategy, daring maneuvers launched under the assumption of total secrecy. Meanwhile, Britain stood isolated after the fall of France in 1940. Supply lines stretched thin across the Atlantic. U-boats lurked beneath dark waters, sinking cargo ships faster than they could be replaced. Each loss meant fewer supplies, less fuel, dwindling morale. British survival depended not only on ships and soldiers, but on information. And without understanding German communications, Britain was fighting blindfolded. Yet even as German commanders typed their encrypted orders with absolute faith, fragments of those transmissions were being collected, recorded, studied in quiet rooms far from the front lines. Analysts stared at strings of nonsense letters, searching for structure within chaos. They did not yet know how to dismantle the cipher. They did not know how long it would take. They only knew that somewhere inside those impossible permutations lay patterns, and patterns, by their nature, could be understood. Because no machine, however sophisticated, is immune to the fingerprints of the humans who operate it. The illusion of invincibility depended on perfection. But perfection is a myth sustained only until someone dares to question it. And as German confidence grew stronger, so too did a hidden determination in Britain, a conviction that mathematics, patience, and ingenuity might pierce the armor that tanks and bombs could not. A second war had begun, not in trenches, not in the skies, but in the realm of logic, and before long, the fate of nations would hinge not on firepower, but on minds willing to challenge the impossible. If you're drawn to stories where intellect reshapes history and hidden battles determine the fate of the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps more people discover these untold chapters of history, stories that remind us that the quietest wars often change the world the most. Because the machine that promised invincibility had just met its first true adversary. The manor house stood quietly in the Buckinghamshire countryside, its red brick facade giving no hint of the storm raging inside. And if the world had known what was unfolding there, the course of the war might have shifted overnight. This was Bletchley Park, an unassuming estate transformed into the epicenter of Britain's most guarded secret. Beyond its gates, the war was measured in bomb craters and burning ships. Inside, it was measured in letters. Endless letters, typed, sorted, pinned to walls, scribbled across notebooks. Streams of intercepted German signals poured in daily, incomprehensible yet urgent. Every undecoded message represented a convoy at risk, a city in danger, a decision already in motion. And somewhere in that torrent of encrypted chaos, there had to be a weakness, but if it wasn't found soon, Britain might not survive long enough to exploit it. The people gathered there were unlike any traditional army. Mathematicians recruited from universities, linguists fluent in German dialects, chess champions capable of holding dozens of hypothetical moves in their minds, even crossword puzzle solvers handpicked from newspaper contests. They were assigned to huts, wooden structures hastily built on the grounds, each devoted to a fragment of the problem. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and shrouded in silence. They signed the Official Secrets Act. They could not tell spouses, parents, or friends what they were doing. Many did not even know how their individual tasks fit into the larger mission. Inside Hut 8, the focus was naval Enigma, the version used by German U-boats that were devastating Allied shipping lanes. The stakes could not have been higher. Britain depended on imported food, fuel, and ammunition. Each week, merchant ships vanished beneath the Atlantic waves. Survivors spoke of torpedoes striking without warning, of freezing water swallowing entire crews. Without cracking naval Enigma, Britain's lifeline would snap. The difficulty was staggering. Enigma did not simply scramble letters. It transformed them through constantly shifting internal states. Each day at midnight, German operators changed their settings according to codebooks distributed across the Reich. Even if yesterday's configuration were somehow discovered, today's would be entirely different. The mathematical possibilities were so vast that attempting every combination by hand would take longer than the war itself, and Britain did not have that kind of time. But Enigma's greatest strength concealed its flaw. It relied on human beings. German operators, despite strict protocol, developed habits. They reused message keys. They sent weather reports at predictable times. They began transmissions with familiar phrases, Heil Hitler appearing more often than discipline would have allowed. These small repetitions created patterns. And patterns are footholds for those trained to see them. Yet spotting patterns was only the beginning. Exploiting them required speed, far more speed than pencils and paper could provide. As weeks stretched into months, tension mounted. Each failed attempt meant more ships lost, more lives erased from convoy lists. Codebreakers worked through the night, fueled by weak tea and urgency. Tempers frayed, doubt crept in. What if the Germans were right? What if Enigma truly was unbreakable? And then whispers began circulating through the huts. A mathematician, quiet, intense, unconventional, was proposing a radically different approach. He believed that instead of humans chasing every possibility, machines could be built to chase them instead. The idea sounded almost fantastical. Britain was fighting for survival, resources were scarce. Building complex electromechanical devices during wartime seemed reckless. Yet the alternative was far worse. If the Atlantic supply line collapsed, Britain would starve. If Britain fell, the last major foothold against Nazi Europe would vanish. And if Enigma remained secure, Germany would maneuver in darkness while the Allies stumbled in daylight. Somewhere between desperation and genius, a new idea was taking shape. But if this bold gamble failed, it would cost precious time Britain could never recover. There are moments in history when survival depends not on armies, but on imagination, and in 1940, as Britain stood perilously alone, the fate of the Atlantic seemed to rest on a man who preferred equations to conversation. His name was Alan Turing. Thin, reserved, often awkward in social settings, Turing did not resemble a wartime hero. Yet within the huts of Bletchley Park, he possessed something rarer than charisma, clarity. Years before the war, he had proposed an abstract concept known as the Turing machine, a theoretical device capable of performing logical operations step by step. At the time, it had been a philosophical exploration of computation. Now it was about to become a weapon, and if it failed, Britain's last defensive lifeline might dissolve beneath the waves. Turing understood that Enigma's complexity was not mystical. It was systematic, and what is systematic can be mechanized. The problem was not simply the staggering number of rotor combinations, it was the time required to test them. Human code breakers could identify likely fragments of text, known as cribs, but checking each possible configuration manually was impossibly slow. The war was accelerating. The codebreakers needed speed to match it. Working alongside engineer Harold Dawkins and building upon earlier polished cryptanalytic breakthroughs, Turing helped design an electromechanical device that would simulate multiple Enigma machines at once. It was called the Bombe, towering cabinets filled with rotating drums and intricate wiring. The machine clattered and hummed as it worked. It did not decrypt messages outright. Instead, it eliminated impossibilities. It searched for logical contradictions in potential settings. If a proposed configuration violated Enigma's internal rules, the Bombe discarded it instantly. What once required weeks could now be reduced to hours. But theory is fragile until tested. Autumn 1940, the Battle of Britain raged overhead. London burned under Luftwaffe bombing raids. At Bletchley, the first operational bombs were switched on. The room vibrated with mechanical rhythm as drums spun through permutations at astonishing speed. Operators, many of them young women recruited for precision and discipline, monitored the machines constantly, adjusting wiring and recording results. The air smelled of oil and heated metal. Hope flickered cautiously. Yet as days passed without decisive breakthrough, doubt pressed heavily. Had they miscalculated? Had Enigma evolved beyond their reach? Then a stop, a halt in the relentless spinning. A possible configuration, verification followed, tense and deliberate. When the decoded text finally emerged, it was not dramatic, not a grand battle plan. Just routine naval communication, coordinates, weather, movement orders, but it was readable. For the first time, the Allies were not guessing, they were listening. The breakthrough did not shatter Enigma in a single stroke. Each day required fresh settings, new runs of the bomb, constant refinement. Yet a door had opened, and through it flowed insight into U-boat positions, supply routes, operational intentions. Convoys could now be rerouted away from danger. Naval patrols could intercept submarines with calculated precision. The Atlantic, once a graveyard of uncertainty, began to tilt subtly toward Allied control. And still, the Germans transmitted confidently, unaware their encrypted shield had been pierced. This was not the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of a new phase, one defined not by desperation, but by advantage. Intelligence derived from Enigma, later codenamed Ultra, would influence campaigns across North Africa and Europe. It would shape preparation for future invasions, yet every success carried a risk. If Germany suspected its cipher compromised, it could redesign the system overnight. Secrecy became as vital as decryption. The codebreakers could not celebrate publicly, they could not explain their impact. Many families would never know the role their sons and daughters played in shifting the war's trajectory. Turing himself would receive little recognition during his lifetime. His mind, which had reimagined computation under the pressure of global conflict, was already pointing toward a future far beyond wartime necessity. If this story reveals how intellect can outmaneuver intimidation, consider subscribing and liking the video. It helps more people discover how hidden thinkers reshape the world and ensures these silent victories are never forgotten. Because although Enigma had been cracked, the most dangerous question remained unanswered. How do you use secret knowledge without revealing you possess it? By 1941, the Allies possessed something priceless: foresight. Yet foresight, if revealed, could vanish overnight, and if Germany ever realized Enigma had been compromised, the fragile advantage painstakingly built at Bletchley Park would evaporate instantly. The intelligence derived from Enigma decrypts was codenamed Ultra, It flowed quietly from the huts of Bletchley to Britain's highest military authorities. Convoys crossing the Atlantic were rerouted away from valve packs of U-boats. Naval forces were dispatched with uncanny precision. Gradually, sinkings decreased. The tide of the Battle of the Atlantic began to turn, not dramatically, but measurably. And if the Germans noticed how often their submarines were being intercepted, they might begin to ask dangerous questions. So commanders made choices that still trouble historians. They could not act on every decoded message. If a convoy suddenly avoided every ambush, suspicion would arise. Sometimes ships were allowed to sail into peril, sometimes warnings were withheld. Intelligence had to be used sparingly, strategically, invisibly. War is often portrayed as a clash of armies, but here it became a calculus of secrecy. How many lives could be saved without exposing the source? How much restraint was necessary to protect a greater, long-term advantage? The moral weight of those decisions was immense. Ultra-intelligence expanded beyond the Atlantic. It shaped campaigns in North Africa, offering insight into German supply shortages and troop movements. It informed air defense preparations. It influenced deception strategies leading up to D-Day. By 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, they did so with unprecedented awareness of German deployments, knowledge sharpened by years of intercepted communications. But Enigma did not end the war overnight. It shortened it. Historians estimate that code-breaking may have reduced the conflict in Europe by up to 2 years, saving millions of lives. Yet those numbers remain debated, partially because so much of the operation remained classified long after 1945. The public narrative of victory celebrated generals, tanks, aircraft carriers. The silent war of logic stayed buried in archives. And beyond the battlefield, something transformative had been born. The bomb machines, clattering, relentless, primitive by modern standards, represented more than wartime innovation. They embodied applied computation. The principles refined at Bletchley would influence post-war research into programmable electronic computers. The conceptual groundwork laid by Alan Turing helped shape the digital age itself. Modern encryption, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence all trace part of their lineage back to those wooden huts in rural England where patterns were hunted under the pressure of annihilation. For decades, the code breakers received little recognition. Many carried their secret to the grave. Turing himself, prosecuted in 1952 for his homosexuality and subjected to chemical castration, died in 1950 in circumstances ruled a suicide, a tragic end for a man whose mind had helped preserve the very freedoms denied to him. Only in later generations did public acknowledgement begin to surface. The Enigma story is not one of spectacle, it is one of patience. Of sleepless nights bent over meaningless letters that slowly began to make sense. Of collaboration between mathematicians, engineers, linguists, and operators who never met the soldiers they saved. Of intellect confronting intimidation and winning quietly. In a war defined by mechanized destruction, it was ultimately the human capacity for abstraction, cooperation, and disciplined imagination that shifted the balance. The illusion of Nazi technological invincibility did not fall to superior firepower. It fell to minds willing to question it, and in that quiet victory, the modern world began.